S-curve, you see why that's the case. Ultimately, it's the cost of borrowing in money terms, adjusted for inflation, that you as a businessman would care about, and also, although it doesn't work for the argument, you as a consumer would care about as well. So, we can now study the implications of changing inflation expectations. So, I'm drawing the ISLM diagram with the nominal interest rates on the vertical axis. Which you know is the appropriate choice so far as the LN curve is concerned. So that's our LN curve. We could also, in this diagram, draw the IS curve without any modification if it so happened that no inflation was either expected, there was no inflation expected and there was no deflation expected either. That's actually what we usually assume, of course, when drawing both IS and LM on the same set of axes. In this question, though, people are going to expect deflation. And that means that real interest rates need to be calculated from an adjusted nominal interest rate. So suppose we were at this point here. Nominal interest rate of I1, output of Y1. That's not the equilibrium. That's just a point that's an equilibrium in the goods market, but not an equilibrium in the money market. We can ask, if people start to expect deflation, what's going to happen to demand if it were the case that the nominal interest rate remained at I1? What does the Fisher equation tell us? It tells us that as inflation expectations fall, for example, become negative, starting at 0, that tells us that real interest rates go up for each value of the nominal interest rate. Just like in our example. If the nominal interest rate stayed at 5, people started to expect deflation. That means effectively the real interest rate is larger than 5. So what will happen to demand? Will it be larger or smaller than Y1? It's going to end up being smaller. So the IS curve drawn on a set of axes with the nominal interest rates there, that shifts left when people expect deflation. Shift right if people expect inflation. Demand is basically falling because firms are less willing to invest, just like in the example I gave. So the level of output that's consistent with goods market equilibrium at that interest rate is now lower. Basically, investment demand is going down. Overall demand is down. Okay, we're now in a position to join together all the dots, do a complete analysis of the problem of the liquidity trap when there are expectations of falling prices. Of course, to talk about that, we need to explain where the price level comes from, so therefore where inflation itself is going to come from. So we need to go beyond ISLM and put this together with aggregate demand, aggregate supply. So we have most of the ingredients for that. So let's recall what we know. We're going to look at determination of the price level and outputs in a situation where people come to expect deflation, in a situation where the central bank or monetary policy has got to a point where nominal interest rates have reached zero, so you've got to the liquidity trap. So we know that the aggregate demand curve has a vertical section when we are in the liquidity trap. That's AD. To complete the picture, we need to add the supply curve, and if the supply curve intersects AD on the vertical section, that means we're in a position where interest rates actually are at zero. So that's going to be our starting point for the analysis we do next. Let's call that AD0, AS0, price 0, price P0, and Y0. So what happens when people start to expect deflation? What will happen to aggregate demand? Aggregate demand we obtained from ISLM. You can see above what effect the expected deflation is having on the IS curve. It's shifting it left, reducing demand. So its effect on the aggregate demand curve is what?
AD.
It is to shift it to the left. Now, what about the vertical segment? Does that get shifted to the left? You need to have a look above. Suppose we got onto the horizontal section of LM. Would expectations of deflation still reduce demand? The answer is yes, because if you're shifting IS left, it doesn't matter whether you're on the horizontal segment or not. If anything, the effect is larger on the horizontal segment. So if anything, the shift you'll see for aggregate demand is larger than it is for the normal part of the aggregate demand. So this is actually not a parallel shift. You see the effect is worse in the liquidity trap range because interest rates aren't dropping as they would be normally. You're moving the whole distance of the leftward shift of IS, whereas when interest rates can fall some amount, you move by less than that. This leftward shift of AD is worse in this range. So what would happen? Assuming for now there's no effect on aggregate supply, price level would fall. Output will fall. Does that make sense?